SeaWorld is keeping a close eye on a killer whale blamed for killing a trainer.
There is a photograph that almost nobody has seen. It was taken backstage at Blue Horizon Oceanic Park sometime in the spring, roughly 4 months before the incident that would make international headlines and permanently alter the trajectory of the marine entertainment industry. In the photograph, Maris Ellington is standing at the edge of Neptune's tank, not performing, not training, just standing, and she is looking at the water with an expression that the people who knew her best have described, in the years since, as something they cannot quite name. Not fear, not doubt, something more complicated than either of those things. Something that sits in the space between deep love and the first quiet awareness that the thing you love might be changing in ways you do not yet have language for. Nobody who saw that photograph before the incident thought much of it. Afterwards, everyone who saw it thought of almost nothing else. That is the particular cruelty of hindsight. It takes every ordinary moment that preceded a tragedy and retroactively fills it with meaning, with warning, with the unbearable sense that the ending was always visible to anyone willing to look. But the truth about what happened at Blue Horizon is not a story about missed signals or unavoidable fate. It is a story about a system, a carefully constructed, financially motivated, institutionally protected system that took a 27-year-old woman who loved the ocean more than almost anything in the world, placed her inside conditions it knew to be dangerous, and then failed her in every way that mattered when those conditions finally produced the outcome that its own internal documentation had predicted. This is that story, told from the inside out. To understand what happened to Maris Ellington, you first have to understand what it actually meant to be an Orca trainer at a facility like Blue Horizon. Not the version that the park's promotional materials described, not the version that appeared in the carefully produced behind-the-scenes content the marketing team posted online, but the actual daily reality of the job as the people who did it experienced it. Orca training at a professional marine park is not, at its foundation, a performance discipline. It is a relationship discipline. The behavioral techniques involved, operant conditioning, positive reinforcement, desensitization protocols, are sophisticated tools, but they are tools in service of something more fundamental, which is the construction of a functional working relationship between a human being and an animal that outweighs them by a factor of 50 or more and could end that relationship at any moment it chose. The trainers who were genuinely excellent at this work were not excellent because they had mastered a set of technical procedures. They were excellent because they had developed an almost preternatural sensitivity to the animals they worked with, a capacity to read behavioral microexpressions, to detect shifts in mood and motivation that had no obvious physical marker, to make real-time adjustments based on information that was partly empirical and partly intuitive in ways that even the trainers themselves struggled to fully articulate. Maris Ellington was, by every account from every colleague who worked alongside her, one of those genuinely excellent trainers. She had spent years building her understanding of Neptune specifically, learning his patterns, his preferences, his triggers, the particular quality of attention he brought to different types of sessions on different types of days. That knowledge was real. It was earned through thousands of hours of patient, careful observation. And it was also, ultimately, insufficient, not because Maris lacked skill or dedication, but because the institutional environment around her had allowed Neptune's psychological state to deteriorate to a point that her individual expertise could not compensate for. Neptune's history at Blue Horizon was longer than Maris's tenure there, and understanding that history is essential to understanding what he had become by the time of the incident. He had arrived at the facility as a young animal, transferred from another marine park in a transaction that prioritized Blue Horizon's need for a headline attraction over any assessment of Neptune's behavioral stability or the potential impact of another facility transfer on an animal that had already experienced significant disruption. In the wild, orcas do not transfer between social groups. Their family bonds are lifelong, their social structures are fixed, and the psychological security they derive from those structures is foundational to their behavioral stability. Each transfer Neptune had experienced, each severance from whatever social connections he had formed, each introduction to a new tank, new animals, new trainers, new performance expectations, had added another layer to a psychological profile that was becoming progressively more complex and progressively more volatile in ways that experienced behavioral professionals recognized and documented, even as institutional management consistently declined to act on those assessments in any meaningful way. By the time the senior trainer who would eventually resign had submitted the formal written request to remove Neptune from performance programming, the behavioral record was unambiguous. The tail slapping against tank walls, a stereotypic behavior with no wild equivalent, universally recognized as a stress indicator. The command refusals, not occasional, not attributable to normal variation in animal motivation, but consistent and escalating. The what trainers called gait unpredictability, a volatility in the initial moments of trainer-animal interaction that represented a fundamental departure from Neptune's established behavioral baseline. None of this was hidden. All of it was documented. And all of it was weighed against the revenue Neptune generated and found, by the people with institutional authority, to be less important. What happened inside Blue Horizon's management structure in the months before the incident is a case study in how organizations that are built around a single critical revenue source develop systematic blind spots around the risks associated with that source. This is not unique to the marine entertainment industry. It happens in mining companies that continue operating after safety inspectors flag structural instability. It happens in pharmaceutical companies that continue marketing products after internal studies raise efficacy concerns. It happens wherever the financial cost of acknowledging a problem is high enough that the institutional incentive to not acknowledge it becomes overwhelming. At Blue Horizon, the financial cost of acknowledging Neptune's behavioral deterioration was existential. Without Neptune performing, the park's revenue model collapsed. That reality shaped every internal conversation about his behavior, every assessment of the risk his continued performance represented, every decision about whether the warnings being raised by trained professionals constituted sufficient grounds to interrupt the show schedule. The senior trainer who resigned understood this dynamic clearly and articulated it explicitly in communications that later became part of the litigation record. Their argument was not simply that Neptune was dangerous, though the documentation supported that conclusion. Their argument was that the institutional structure of Blue Horizon made it impossible to respond appropriately to Neptune's behavioral deterioration, because appropriate response would have required prioritizing safety over revenue in a context where management had demonstrated repeatedly and consistently that it would not do so. That argument was vindicated in the most terrible possible way on the afternoon of the incident. But the vindication came far too late to matter for Maris Ellington. The morning of the incident was, by all accounts, unremarkable. Maris had completed an earlier training session with Neptune that had gone smoothly. No command refusals, no unusual behavioral signals, nothing that deviated meaningfully from what a normal session looked like. She told her colleagues she felt he was in a stable place. That assessment was not wishful thinking or professional recklessness. It was the honest judgment of someone who knew this animal better than almost anyone and who was reading the available evidence as accurately as her expertise allowed. What her expertise could not account for was the accumulated weight of months of psychological stress that had no consistent visible expression, stress that could produce a morning session of apparent normalcy and an afternoon session of catastrophic behavioral breakdown without any reliable warning in between. Because that is precisely what chronic psychological deterioration in highly intelligent animals can look like. The amphitheater filled for the afternoon show with approximately 500 people who had no awareness of any of this context. They had come to watch Neptune perform. They had come to feel the particular kind of wonder that only exists when a 10,000-pound animal launches itself out of the water and hangs for a moment against the sky before crashing back into the surface in an explosion of white water. They had come, many of them, because they had seen the promotional materials, the carefully produced content, the messaging that positioned Blue Horizon as a place where the relationship between humans and these magnificent animals was a story of mutual respect and genuine connection. Some of what they were about to see would fit that description. The rest of it would not. The show opened exactly as choreographed. Neptune's entries were powerful and precise. His responses to Maris's cues were fluid and reliable. The crowd moved through its predictable sequence of gasps and applause and laughter and wonder, and for the first several minutes of the performance, everything inside that amphitheater was exactly what it appeared to be. a spectacular display of the working relationship between a supremely skilled trainer and an animal of extraordinary physical capability. Then came the synchronized swim sequence. This was always the emotional centerpiece of the show, the moment that the entire performance built toward. The sequence where Maris entered the water and she and Neptune moved together in a choreography that, when it worked, looked less like a trained performance and more like a glimpse of something genuinely transcendent. She entered the water. Neptune approached. She gave the signal for the breach maneuver. His trajectory initially suggested compliance. And then something happened, something that occurred at a neurological and behavioral level that no camera captured and no witness could fully describe, and Neptune lunged. The force of his initial strike was measured later in biomechanical analysis at several thousand pounds per square inch. Maris was thrown upward, her body briefly visible above the waterline in a moment that witnesses described as surreal and impossible, before Neptune pulled her back under. The trainers on the platform responded immediately and correctly, deploying every element of the emergency distraction protocol simultaneously. None of it worked. Neptune's behavioral state had crossed a threshold where the tools available to the platform team could not reach him. The attack continued for more than a minute. When Neptune finally released Maris, she rose to the surface with multiple fractured ribs, a punctured lung, and blunt force trauma to her chest and abdomen that was incompatible with survival. The medics who worked on her poolside had no clinical pathway to reversing the damage. She was 27 years old. She had never had the chance to do most of the things she had planned to do with her life. And the institution she had given that life to had known, for months, that this moment was possible, and had chosen to keep the show running anyway. The litigation that followed Maris Ellington's death was, in a legal sense, a process of documentation, a systematic excavation of the internal record that Blue Horizon had never intended to make public. What that excavation produced was damning in a way that went beyond any individual decision or any individual decision-maker. The internal memos, the incident logs, the behavioral assessments submitted by trainers and filed without response, the formal written request for Neptune's removal from performance programming and the denial that followed, the resignation letter from the senior trainer that, read in retrospect, constituted one of the clearest and most prescient warnings in the entire record. All of it had existed before the incident. All of it had been available to the people with authority to act on it. None of it had been sufficient to interrupt the performance schedule. The wrongful death lawsuit filed by Maris's parents did not merely seek financial compensation, though it sought that as well. It sought a formal institutional reckoning, a public acknowledgement, enforceable through legal process, that Blue Horizon had failed its trainer in ways that were specific, documented, and preventable. The settlement the park reached with the family included substantial financial terms and a formal commitment to fund independent research into the psychological welfare of captive cetaceans. In the language of legal settlements, that research commitment was as close as the institution could come to admitting that it had been operating without adequate understanding of the animals at the center of its business model. Blue Horizon permanently suspended all Orca performances. Without Neptune drawing crowds, the park's financial structure deteriorated rapidly and irreversibly. Within a few years, it filed for bankruptcy and closed. Neptune was transferred to a marine sanctuary in British Columbia. Open water, no performance requirements, no food reward conditioning cycles, no amphitheater. Whether that transition represented anything like healing for an animal whose psychological architecture had been shaped by years of captivity is a question that behavioral researchers have continued to study without reaching any simple conclusions. But it represented something. It represented an acknowledgement, however belated and however legally compelled, that Neptune's needs mattered and that the environment he had been living in had not served them. Maris Ellington did not live to see that acknowledgement. She deserved to. The broader industry context into which Maris Ellington's death landed was one that had been accumulating incidents, warnings, and unresolved questions for decades. Her case was not the first time a marine park trainer had been seriously injured or killed by a captive orca, and it was not the last. Each incident in this pattern shares structural features that go beyond the surface details. The specific animal, the specific facility, the specific sequence of events that produce the outcome. What they share is the same fundamental dynamic. An animal whose psychological state had been deteriorating under conditions of chronic captivity stress, a documentary record of behavioral warning signs that had been observed and reported by trained professionals, and an institutional response that prioritized performance continuity over the safety implications of that record. Claudia Volhart survived her attack at Loro Park, but the orca involved, Takoa, a young male with a history of early maternal separation, repeated facility transfers, and ongoing aggression from other orcas in his enclosure, presented a behavioral profile that was in many ways a compressed version of what Neptune had shown at Blue Horizon. The circumstances differed. The underlying structural dynamic did not. Alexis Martinez did not survive his encounter with Quito at a Tenerife facility in December 2009, and the park's initial public characterization of his death as an accident with no signs of violence was contradicted so thoroughly by the autopsy findings, compression fractures, organ damage, bite marks, that the divergence itself became a major focus of subsequent scrutiny. The question of how marine entertainment facilities disclosed, described, and managed public information about trainer animal incidents turned out to be nearly as significant as the incidents themselves, because it revealed the degree to which institutional self-protection shaped not just operational decisions, but the fundamental narrative that reached the public about what these facilities actually were and what happened inside them. Ken Peters spent 9 minutes in Kasaka's grip at SeaWorld San Diego in 2006, and the fact that this was the second documented attack by the same animal on the same trainer raised questions that the marine park industry was never fully able to answer on terms that satisfied outside observers. Why was Peters still working with Kasaka after the first attack? What institutional logic produced that outcome? The answers, when they emerged through subsequent investigation and litigation, pointed to the same structural reality that every other incident in this pattern pointed to. A system that had been built around the performance and profitability of these animals in ways that made genuinely prioritizing their welfare and the safety of the humans who worked with them structurally difficult in ways that went far beyond any individual bad decision or individual bad actor. The scientific understanding of captive orca welfare that has developed over the past 2 decades makes the decisions made at facilities like Blue Horizon look not just wrong in retrospect, but wrong in ways that were knowable at the time. Researchers studying captive orca behavior had been documenting the behavioral indicators of chronic stress, the stereotypic behaviors, the social aggression, the collapsed dorsal fins, the hyperaggression that had no parallel in wild populations, for years before the incidents that finally forced a broader public reckoning. The data was available. The expertise existed. What did not exist, in sufficient measure, was the institutional willingness to let that data and that expertise actually drive operational decisions when doing so conflicted with the economic model those institutions depended on. That gap, between what was known and what was acted upon, is the central moral failure of the captive marine entertainment industry, and it is a failure that belongs not to individual trainers or individual animals, but to the institutional and economic structures that shaped every decision made inside those facilities. Maris Ellington was not failed by Neptune. She was failed by a system that placed her in the water with an animal whose psychological state made that interaction dangerous, in full awareness of the documentation that supported that assessment, and that continued to do so because the alternative was financially unacceptable. That is the honest account of what happened. Everything else, the tragedy of an individual life, the grief of a family, the horror experienced by 500 people in an amphitheater on an ordinary afternoon, flows from that structural reality. What comes after stories like this one is always, in some form, a question about change, about whether the tragedies that force industries and institutions to confront their failures actually produce the kind of structural reform that prevents those failures from recurring, or whether they produce a period of heightened scrutiny followed by a gradual return to the operational patterns that produced the problem in the first place. In the case of the captive marine entertainment industry, the evidence for genuine structural change is real but uneven. Legislative changes in multiple jurisdictions have restricted captive cetacean breeding and performance programs in ways that were unimaginable a decade earlier. Public attitudes toward marine park orca shows have shifted dramatically, driven by documentary filmmaking, investigative journalism, and the cumulative weight of incident after incident that could no longer be credibly characterized as isolated anomalies. Several major facilities have committed to phasing out Orca entertainment programs and transitioning towards sanctuary-based models that prioritize animal welfare over commercial utility. These are real shifts. They represent genuine progress. But they came after decades of incidents that should have prompted action far sooner. And they came too late for the people whose names are permanently attached to the cases that finally made the costs of institutional inaction impossible to sustain. Maris Ellington was 27 years old when she died in the water at Blue Horizon Oceanic Park. She had spent her entire adult life learning to understand and advocate for the animals she worked with. In a different institutional context, one where the warnings of experienced professionals were actually acted upon, where animal welfare genuinely preceded revenue in the hierarchy of institutional values, where the documented deterioration of a captive orca's psychological state was treated as the serious safety issue it was, she might still be doing that work today. The fact that she is not an accident and not a mystery. It is the documented, specific, preventable outcome of choices that were made by people who had the authority and the information to make different ones. That is the story of Maris Ellington. And it is a story that the marine entertainment industry and everyone who has ever bought a ticket to one of its shows has an obligation to understand in full.